The Batterymen are an archetype of thunder monsters designed around outputting big damage and swarming the board quickly, but often disappearing just as quickly. The deck had a lot of promise at different points, and was by no means a weak deck, but it never actually converted into widespread competitive success. So today, we're going to go over the Batteryman archetype and explore its successes and failures. As an archetype, Batteryman is mostly focused on swarming the board with powerful monsters to push through powerful OTKs. The deck is heavily focused on attack and defense modulation, based on the first monsters printed in the archetype, Batteryman AA. This level 3 light monster has 0 attack and defense, but if all Batteryman AAs you control are in attack position, it gives them all 1000 attack. And it does the same for defense if they're in defense position as well. This type of attack gain is present on many of the cards in this archetype. To facilitate the attack boosting strategy, the deck has a ton of cards that help to swarm the field. Battery Charger is an archetype-specific monster reborn for the paltry cost of 500 life points, which was great back in the day. Batteryman Microcell is a level 1 Light Thunder flip monster, with the effect to summon a level 4 lower battery monster from your deck besides itself when it's flipped face up. And then, if it's destroyed by battle, you get to draw a card. Batteryman Charger is a level 5 Light Thunder with 1800 attack and 1200 defense, which summons a Batteryman monster from hand or deck on normal summon, and gains 300 attack and defense for each other Thunder monster you control. Portable Battery Pack is a double Call the Haunted for Batteryman, you get the idea. They can summon a lot of monsters all at once, though for the most part it does require a bit of setup. On top of all of this, they also have their boss monster, Batteryman Industrial Strength. This is a level 8 Light Thunder monster with 2600 attack and 0 defense. It can't be normal summoned or set, and can only be special summoned from your hand by banishing 2 Batteryman monsters from your graveyard. It has the effect where, once per turn, you can banish a Thunder monster from your grave to destroy 1 spell and 1 spell or trap card your opponent controls. This was essentially Dark Arm Dragon at home for a lot of children around this point in the game's history, as the low rarity of Batteryman and the suite of powerful cards it boasted, including Industrial Strength, caught the eye of many a younger duelist. And from what we discussed so far, this sounds great. It can put out big damage, it can interact with the opponent's board, it even has searchers like a Microcell and 9V to up its consistency. It even has broken cards we haven't gotten to mention yet, like Short Circuit, which destroy all cards your opponent controls at no cost to you. Unfortunately, like with most purchases, terms and conditions may apply. The big problem with Batteryman as an archetype is that while they were very powerful cards and effects, all of those effects have a ton of restrictions on them that make it difficult to utilize those effects. The more you look at the individual cards in the archetype, the more cards you notice that don't actually work well together. The most infamous example of this has to be Batteryman C, which is very similar to Batteryman AA. This monster gives all your machine type monsters 500 attack if every Batteryman C you control is in attack position, and likewise for defense. Now, the problem here is very simple. This is a Thunder monster, not a machine. And in fact, all of the Batteryman monsters are Thunders, meaning this card actually does stone cold nothing for the archetype it's part of. This alone isn't the biggest problem, but it's something that comes up over and over as you look at the cards in this archetype. While they have good effects, they all only work in specific situations. For example, Short Circuit may have an insanely powerful effect in destroying all of your opponent's cards, but it only works if you have 3 or more Batteryman monsters on the field. This means that the card is almost never online, so it's often quite bad to have in your hand. However, the card is simply too powerful to ignore, so most Batteryman decks still played it regardless. This is a bit of a common theme with Batteryman, truth be told. Many of the deck's cards just have these tiny little problems that make them more situational than they should be. Batteryman D, for example, is a level 1 Light Thunder with 0 attack and 1900 defense, and the effect to prevent your opponent from targeting your other Thunder monsters for attacks, but only while in face-up defense position. While the deck has a few ways of special summoning out their monsters, it's still far less reliable than other cards with similar effects. Batteryman Charger is an amazing way to swarm the board, and a good beater in its own right with the correct setup, but being restricted to summoning from the deck only when it's normal summoned severely limits the ways you can use the card. Batteryman AAA can special summon another copy of itself from your hand or graveyard when it's normal summoned or flip face up, which can be super useful for setting up extra deck plays or turning on Short Circuit, but it requires setting up your graveyard first, something that Batteryman has no cards to help enable outside of generic options. It also has 0 attack and defense, meaning that it doesn't help with the deck's OTK strategy, unless you have a way to use it as a material for other plays. It has a Stratos-like effect in Batteryman 9V, but that card blows itself up during the end phase, making using it to defend your life points a struggle. Even its boss monster, Industrial Strength, has the issue where, once you finally summon it, it can only use its destruction effect if your opponent has both a monster and a spell or trap card for it to destroy. If they only have one, it won't actually do anything. These heavy restrictions and lack of easy synergies create a sort of stop and go feeling to the deck. Sometimes the deck draws a ton of powerful cards in just the right order, and it feels unbeatable. Other times it draws a bunch of cards that don't quite work well together, and it feels like it can't actually do anything. For example, the best start the deck has was the Monarch Stormforth into Batteryman Charger, cards that otherwise did very little on their own. The deck ends up being very high-rolly, and this inconsistency is a big flaw that other decks can easily exploit. Contributing to this inconsistency is the fact that the deck wasn't really that good at finding important pieces. Sure, you did have 9V to find monsters for you, but that was really it. It didn't have any way of sending cards from deck to graveyard or anything of the sort. And only having one searcher is pretty bad, considering the deck was all about swarming the board with full playsets of particular monsters. Additionally, the deck has Stone Cold 0 ways to try and find its spell and trap support, which is a real shame since those are probably some of the better cards in the archetype. Short Circuit is a great board wipe. Recycling batteries and Quick Charger are good recursion. And Portable Battery Pack would have been remembered as one of the most broken cards of all time if it were for a meta-relevant archetype. However, these cards are all quite situational. You would have to already have Batteryman in the graveyard for most of them to work, Short Circuit only works if you already had a board, and other support cards like Judgment of Thunder also need to be activated at very specific times to be effective. The fact that you can't find these cards not only means that you won't have access to them as often, it means that you have to go down one of two pretty bad roads. One is playing only a few copies of these cards, which means they won't show up when you need them. The other is maxing out on copies of these cards, which means you'll often draw them when you don't need them all that often, and they'll actively harm your game plan. Either way, the deck becomes even more clunky and inconsistent. Batteryman legitimately may be one of the decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! That would benefit most from a spell and trap card searcher, considering that they're both the most powerful and most situational cards in the archetype. On top of this lack of consistency, the actual strategy at play here has a few major flaws. There have been a few relatively successful OTK-focused archetypes, and we can learn a thing or two by comparing Batteryman to those other decks. One very easy example is that of the Skull Servant archetype. This deck is built around King of the Skull Servants, which gains 1000 attack for each Skull Servant or King of Skull Servant in your graveyard. The deck has been designed around putting as many Skull Servants into the graveyard as quickly as they could to make sure King becomes absolutely massive, so they can get in for big damage. This is, as you probably already noticed, exactly what Batteryman AA is trying to do, but with a few key differences. AA requires exactly another AA to be on the field, so it doesn't work with any other Batteryman cards, and doesn't work if they're in the graveyard. While King of the Skull Servants has the same problem, the other cards in the archetype all change their name to Skull Servant in the grave. There's only one card in Batteryman that does this, and it's the most recent piece of support the deck has gotten, Batteryman Solar. While that is helpful, by this point, Batteryman had been dramatically power crept out of the game, so it was very much too little too late. In fact, it came so late into the game that it's more well known for its application in the Thunder Dragons than it is for Batteryman. Just binning a Thunder Dragon from your deck while also putting a Thunder monster on field set up all of the deck's plays. And getting a token off of Solar could help you summon yugioh more easily. This is technically the most success any Batteryman card has had, but considering that it did absolutely nothing for the deck, that isn't exactly a good sign. The deck also had a ton of cards that really didn't vie with these sort of OTKs. AAA and D both have 0 attack, and the deck doesn't have any cards that buff all of their monsters' attack points. While the deck could go for huge damage by combining Batteryman AA and cards like Infernal Reckless Summon, it was often a lot worse at going for damage than simple beatdown strategies. The result is an OTK deck that, while capable of OTKs, was never the best at them. As a consolation, the deck had many other strengths, but it was also never the best in those areas either. Earlier, we called Batteryman Industrial Strength Dark Arm Dragon at home, and that is basically the role the deck served in the metagame. Dark-Armed Dragon released just a few months before Industrial Strength did, and it absolutely ruled the metagame at the time. This, combined with powerful dark support cards like Crush Card Virus and Allure of Darkness, created a deck that could absolutely overwhelm the opponent in terms of card advantage. Batteryman, once again, could kind of do this if you squinted. It did have a lot of ways to get card advantage over the opponent, and could go for big blowout plays if it drew the right combination of cards. However, it was never as powerful or as consistent as what other strategies in the game could be doing. Batteryman fell into the trap that many other archetypes around this time fell into, being a jack of all trades but a master of none. While being kind of good at everything sounds amazing at first, what it actually does is make a deck unfocused. Card games often trend away from versatility and towards efficiency. A card that does one thing well is often more remembered than a card that could theoretically do multiple things poorly. Similarly, a deck that could theoretically draw hands that do multiple different powerful things will perform worse than a deck that always draws a hand that does one powerful thing. There are times where a deck's versatility becomes an issue in of itself, and that's only when a deck can flex multiple versatile options with extreme consistency. If a deck can always build one of multiple powerful boards, it can flex into whatever strategy is best at beating you specifically. We already talked about how Batteryman had fewer searchers than you'd like, so obviously it wasn't flexing between multiple strong game plans. Rather, it was just kind of hoping any hand gave it at least one obvious game plan to commit to for the duel. Despite all of the issues with Batteryman, the deck was successful in a few specific ways. As we've alluded to, this was a very cheap deck for players to pick up, which led to a lot of duelists playing the deck sort of by default. This was especially true for children, the main demographic of players for Yu-Gi-Oh! Back in the day, before the internet was all over the place, building decks was extremely difficult for everyone, and almost impossible for younger kids back in the day. With how strong the best decks around at the time were, younger duelists really needed an easily accessible strategy that could at least play against other decks. Batteryman was kinda perfect for that. It is true that the deck wasn't perfect and had its fair share of flaws, but for Konami's perspective, that actually makes a lot of sense. You don't want the easily available, cheap strategy made of low rarity cards to easily beat your decks built around high rarity chase pulls. However, you still need a cheaper option, especially back in the day when access to cards was more difficult, in order to keep more casual players, or players who can't invest as much money into the game around. So how do you make a strategy that's able to keep those players invested, but not overshadow your higher rarity decks? Batteryman accomplishes this by having cards and effects that genuinely outperform everything else in certain scenarios, but making the player jump through hoops to pull those things off. Short Circuit is an amazing example of this. Getting a Raigeki and a Harpy's Feather Duster on one card is something that literally no other deck in the game at the time could accomplish, unless you want to count Ojamas, I guess. The exact way that Batteryman was designed actually perfectly fills this role. It has a ton of cards that were best in class for a long time, but requires playing an inconsistent and janky deck to make them work. The result is that Batteryman players were able to steal games off of other decks from time to time thanks to the sheer power of their cards without actually overshadowing those decks in the metagame. Something that made this role even better for Batteryman is that the deck is very simple. You set Batteryman Microcell, hope your opponent attacks into it, and keep doing that until you find a blowout card. The deck had just enough depth to be fun, but was simple enough for anyone to pick up and play to some degree of success. So, while the deck was a failure in terms of competitive tournaments, it was a massive success in terms of keeping the game healthy. So that's the Batteryman archetype. The deck was very easy to get a hold of, and was fairly strong for such a low rarity archetype. This made it the deck of choice for many Playground warriors. However, despite its popularity, the deck wasn't particularly powerful. It required very specific combination of cards to pull off its game plan, and often drew hands of cards that didn't work well together. The deck had very few reliable searchers, and had no way of finding its powerful spell and trap card support, which were the main reasons to play the deck in the first place. As a result, the deck was very draw dependent, often having very difficult plays without lucky draws. Even outside of this inconsistency, the deck also wasn't as good at anything as other strategies, being a worse OTK deck and a worse value deck than all other archetypes.